Good afternoon and welcome to our Bible study of Genesis chapter 16. In the last chapter, Abram had offered Eliezer as the heir to his estate and the promise of God. But God said no, it will be someone from your own body. God continues to promise, chapter 15 verses 4 and 5 and 13 and 18, but he also continues to delay the fulfillment. We do not know how much time elapsed between chapter 15 and chapter 16, but it has been 10 years since the first promise of children in chapter 12, as we see in chapter 16, verse 3. We've also not seen a polygamist since Lamech in chapter 4, verse 19. The text says that Hagar was given to Abram as a wife, and in that culture this brought some legal issues for Sarai, Abram, and Hagar. Aside from the patriarchs, there are 7 men who have wives or concubines in the Old Testament. 4 of them will be kings. Some passages will distinguish between a concubine and a wife, but Hagar is identified as a wife. God will bless Hagar and her son, but the promised seed will not be through Hagar. Abram will have to wait longer and trust more before the promise is finally fulfilled. The physical options are being exhausted. Abram will have to depend on an act of God, a miracle, before he and Sarai will become parents. Let's read verses 1 through 6. Now Sarai, the wife of Abram, had not given birth for him, and to her was a female slave, an Egyptian, and her name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, Behold, please, Jehovah has prevented me from giving birth. Come, please, to my female slave. Perhaps I will build a house from her. So Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. The verb I will build was first used in chapter 2, verse 22, when God built the woman from the side of Abram. Here it carries the idea of establishing a family, or fulfilling the promise of the seed. I note to you that the word house or family is not found in the Hebrew, and so the translator has to provide it. Verse 3. Then Sarai, the wife of Abram, took Hagar the Egyptian, her female slave. After 10 years Abram had been dwelling in the land of Canaan, and she gave her to Abram, her husband, for a wife. So he came to Hagar, and she conceived and saw that she was pregnant, and she despised her mistress in her eyes. The word mistress here is the female form of the word for mighty man, or warrior, as we saw back in chapter 6, verse 4. The word will carry the idea of a queen or a queen mother in 1 Kings and 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, as well as in Isaiah and Jeremiah. Verse 5. Then Sarai said to Abram, My wrong is on you. I myself gave my female servant to your embrace, and she sees that she got pregnant, and I am despised in her eyes. Let Jehovah judge between me and you. Then Abram said to Sarai, Behold, your female slave is in your hands. Do to her the good in your eyes. And Sarai treated her harshly, and she fled from her face. To treat harshly means to be afflicted, humbled, or violated. God had promised Abram that his descendants would be treated this way, and the word is also used for the Israelites being treated by the Egyptians in Exodus chapter 1, verses 11 and 12. We were told in chapter 11 and verse 30 that Sarai was barren and had no children, and Moses reminds us in verse 1 that Sarai still was childless. After 10 years, it is easy to get frustrated, even desperate, and either give up or try anything at one's disposal. Hagar, the Egyptian slave, was at Sarai's disposal. We do not know if Sarai obtained Hagar while they were in Egypt or from some other source, but that's not relevant. With Eleazar being from Damascus, chapter 15, verse 2, and Hagar from Egypt, we see that Abraham's household was multicultural. We're not told by Moses, only by Sarai, that Jehovah God had prevented Sarai from becoming pregnant. Notice the entreaty on Sarai's part. She uses the word please twice, and hoping, notice the use of the word perhaps, that Hagar would get pregnant. Abram listened to Sarai's suggestion. We could criticize Abram and ask why he did not approach God and ask him, but Abram's knowledge of God was new and shallow. According to several documents from the 2nd and 1st millennium BC, Sarai's suggestion to Abram was according to legal precedent. The law code of Hammurabi, the texts of Nuzi, Assyrian and Babylonian texts. The child would be raised as Sarai's and Abram's son. That is the significance of Sarai suggesting that she will build a house through Hagar's pregnancy. Notice again in the text that Hagar has the legal status of a wife, chapter 16, verse 3, albeit a second wife. And so Abram came to Hagar, implying a sexual relationship, and she became pregnant. Rather than being jubilant, as perhaps everyone expected, Hagar despised Sarai. When other polygamous relationships have one wife get pregnant rather than the other, jealousy and feelings of superiority always result. It happens here with Hagar as well. Sarai may be blaming Abram when she says, "My wrong is on you." So Sarai calls on Jehovah God to motivate Abram to do something about it. What else could Abram do? He gave Hagar into the hands of Sarai. Notice, to do good. But Sarai treated her harshly, so harshly that Hagar fled from her masters, toward her homeland, Egypt. Moses' audience will be reversing the action, as they are treated harshly in Egypt, and flee to Canaan. It is easy for Christians to criticize Abram for not asking God about Sarai's suggestion. A pensive Abram could reflect on the repercussions of this decision once everything plays out and he learned from his mistake. But troubles happen frequently when man tries to help God fulfill his plans, instead of being patient and waiting for a word from Jehovah God. Moses' audience again will be reversing these behaviors in the sense that they will be leaving Egypt and its harsh treatment of them and traveling back to the Promised Land. The text will explain to Israel the origin of the Ishmaelites. Like other nationalities, these too were relatives of Israel. God will warn the Israelites about treating slaves harshly since they were harshly treated in Egypt. Let's read verses 7 through 12. Then the angel of Jehovah found her by the well of water in the desert by the well on the way to Shur. The expression angel of Jehovah is found 58 times in the Old Testament. The similar phrase angel of God is found another 11 times. The most interesting accounts are found in Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, and Judges. Shur appears to have been close to the border of Egypt, suggesting Hagar was on her way home. Verse 8. The angel of Jehovah said, "Hagar, the female slave of Sarai, from where did you come, and where are you going?" And then she said, "From the face of Sarai, my mistress, I myself am fleeing." So the angel of Jehovah said to her, "Return to your mistress, and submit yourself under her hand." Then the angel of Jehovah said to her, "To increase I will increase your seed, and he will not be counted, he will be a multitude." The phrase, "to increase I will increase," translates the Hebrew emphatic expression. Verse 11. Finally the angel of Jehovah said to her, "Look, you are pregnant, and you will give birth to a son, and you will call his name Ishmael, because Jehovah has heard your suffering. And he himself will be a wild donkey of a man, his hand will be against all, and the hand of all will be against him, and from the face of all his brothers he will dwell." Who is this angel of Jehovah? The challenge in identification is that he is in the same context often identified with God and differentiated from him. The word translated angel, of course, means a messenger. If he is a human messenger, he is often identified as a prophet. If he is a divine messenger, he is often identified as an angel. In chapter 48, verse 16, he is identified as the one who has brought redemption, an idea that is echoed in Exodus chapter 23, verses 20 through 23. Several different possibilities have been suggested. He is a human form of God himself. He is a type or figure of Jesus Christ. He is simply an angel. He is Christ, before Christ came in the flesh. The argument for this idea is that in John 8, verse 58, Jesus refers to the burning bush event, which includes an angel of Jehovah, and Jesus identifies himself with the speaker. But we must admit that a decisive position is not possible. I lean towards him being simply an angel, and he is identified often with Jehovah God because he has the authority to speak for Jehovah God. Jehovah God appears apparently in a unique way to this woman who is not even a relative of Abram, nor descended from Shem. This point argues that the author of Genesis, Moses, was not a Jew, or a die-hard Israelite from later generations. It is not likely that such an individual would have had an angel of Jehovah appear to someone outside of the chosen nation. This messenger knows Hagar's name and her situation, and therefore his questions are likely simply to elicit conversation with her and reflections from her. Hagar responds that she was fleeing from her mistress Sarai. Observe how frequently Moses states the angel of Jehovah speaks to Hagar. One statement is in verse 9, return to your mistress and submit to her. Apparently this was required by the laws of that culture. Statement number 2 is in verse 10, your son will have a multitude of children. Now this was the promise given to Abram, most recently in chapter 15 and verse 5. Abram's promise will be fulfilled through Isaac, but here God gives the same promise to Hagar's son. It also shows God fulfilling through Ishmael his command given to all of humanity in chapter 1 and verse 28. Statement number 3 is in verses 10 and 11. God promises that Hagar will have a son, and she should name him Ishmael, which comes from the Hebrew verb to he hears, to remind Hagar and Ishmael that God heard her prayer, her suffering, and responded. But God also predicts that Ishmael will largely live isolated, like a wild donkey, and his life will be antagonistic towards others. I want you to observe the connection between chapter 16 verse 12 and chapter 25 verse 18. The phrase from the face of his brothers in chapter 16 verse 12 suggests a hostile relationship. I point out to you how similar that phrase is to the one found in chapter 25 and verse 18. The expression is used by Satan in Job chapter 1 verse 11, stating that Job will curse to the face Jehovah God. It is easy to see modern Arabs and Muslims as a fulfillment of this prediction, but I would caution against applying a prophecy in a way that an inspired writer has not applied it. We should always wait for a thus saith the Lord before we speak on God's behalf. It seems strongly to me it is safest to interpret chapter 25 verse 18 as the fulfillment of this prophecy and leave it at that. There is no conflict between Israelites and the Ishmaelites in the Bible. Perhaps we have mixed emotions about Hagar. After all, she apparently despised Sarai first. She did not want to be used, perhaps, as a baby factory. But her response to Sarai precipitated Sarai's response in return, harsh treatment, which motivated Hagar to flee. She went the only place she would know to go, home. The fact that God appeared to her in the form of this angel of Jehovah shows that God cared for her, and he gives her a unique promise and a unique prophecy. For the most part, such promises and prophecies were confined to Abram's family. Israel would know that the Ishmaelites' growth and numbers were predicted by God. But after the book of Genesis, there are not many references to the Ishmaelites. An angel of the Lord, at least one named Gabriel, is seen several times in the New Testament. Verses 13 through 16. So she called the name of Jehovah, the one speaking these things to her, El Yireh, because she said, even here I saw after the seeing one. El Yireh is translated Jehovah sees. He saw Hagar in her suffering, and her thankfulness and praise motivates her to give God. Not identified by this name again in the Bible. She named the well Beer Lahairoi. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered. Beer Lahairoi, or the well of Lahairoi, since Beer is the Hebrew word for well, is located between Kadesh and Bered. We know where Kadesh is. It's 60 miles south of Beersheba. We do not know where Bered is. Verse 15, Hagar bore to Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son after Hagar gave birth, Ishmael. Then Abram was the son of 68 years old when Hagar gave birth to Ishmael for Abram. Other than Jehovah and God, this is now the second designation for Jehovah God, the first being God Most High, from chapter 14, verses 18 through 22, relative to Melchizedek. We do not know the origin of the term, but here it is a non-Israelite, non-Hebrew, non-Jew who designates God as El Yireh. God sees. In fact, she is the only person who gives God a specific name in the whole Bible. Hagar identified him this way because he saw her suffering and responded. And then she designated the place where she saw God, the well of the one who sees me. It was located, Moses tells us, between Kadesh and Bered. Hagar evidently returned home to Abram and Sarai, although the relationship between the three is going to turn sour again in chapter 21. In the last two verses, verses 15 and 16, Hagar is mentioned 3 times, Abram is mentioned 4 times, Sarai is not mentioned at all. Hagar gives birth to a son, and Abram, either informed by God or by Hagar, names the son Ishmael. Until later, Abram will likely believe that Ishmael will be the son of promise. Abraham is now 86 years old, 11 years after he left Ur, in chapter 12 and verse 4. As far as the record is concerned, Jehovah God will not appear to Abram again for another 13 years, where God will again set the record straight, relative to whom the son of promise will be. So out of a sense of gratitude, Hagar names God the one who sees, and she obeys God, returning to Abram and Sarai, submitting to Sarai's leadership, and she gave birth to a boy as God promised, and named him Ishmael, as God commanded. Again, Paul uses the story of Hagar and Ishmael as an allegory to illustrate the difference between Jews, after the flesh, and spiritual Jews, children of promise, in Galatians chapter 4, verses 21 through 31. Thank you for joining me today in our study, and God bless you.